It's Friday night, you know what time it is. I'm Rafael Di Furia. These are some of the do's and don'ts of moving abroad to Europe, and roll that intro. Keep in mind, this list is in no particular order at all, but the first thing I'm going to say is to make sure you understand how you're going to keep connected while you're on the other side of the planet. Well, potentially the other side of the planet. I say this not only so that you can know how you're going to keep in contact with your friends and family. I mean, say, for example, maybe you have to teach grandma how to use WhatsApp, or maybe you have to get grandma a cell phone, a smartphone, so that she can even use WhatsApp to begin with. But one of the other reasons why I think it's really so important is because of the ability to use a translation app and understanding how much your internet is going to cost you, and even doing some research into that ahead of time, I think really makes a big difference, especially for those who work online. It is vital to have your internet connection and to know how that's going to look when you get to the next country and how you can make that happen immediately after stepping off the plane when you are quote unquote fresh off the boat. But even for me, as somebody who is able to speak a bit of Portuguese, I can get around pretty comfortably, although there are some topics where my Portuguese is a bit lacking. And the other day, one of my neighbors came up and started saying, hey, can you please not use your water in part of your apartment for a while? And one of our pipes is leaking and it's a big mess and this and that. So I said, sure, why not? Fine. But they asked me not to use the water, at least until the plumber could come. And so it was going to be the next day. Definitely annoying, but it got to be the late afternoon. Nobody came to my apartment, so I went down, rat-a-tat-tat, ended up speaking to this neighbor, and they started kind of just rambling on in Portuguese, on a level of Portuguese that maybe I could have gotten, but on a topic that I really just couldn't understand, because how often do you really need to be able to talk about plumbing and subjects related to plumbing? I mean, can it happen? Yes, but this is not something that I personally find myself discussing on a regular basis. So I actually ended up pulling out Google Translate. The person thought, oh, well, I can't write. You're going to have, what am I supposed to do with this? I said, no, just speak into the phone and it'll be fine. And it wasn't a translation that made a lot of sense, but because of the Portuguese I already had under my belt, I was able to have it make a bit more sense. There are plenty of apps and products out there that work in this sort of way to varying degrees of success. But in this situation, it definitely made a big difference for me. This will lead me into the first don't, which is don't think you can get away with just speaking your own language. I've mentioned this in so many episodes. Learn the language of the place, because even with a translation app, things might not make perfect sense. And if you have the ability to understand what the language kind of looks like and how it's constructed and the thought process and logic of how things can work, you can start making sense of things as time goes on. Might not be perfect, but because I've spoken so much about this in episodes, I'm going to cut this one here. Before we get to the next point, I do want to say a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis through rafaeldifuria.com/Patreon, patreon.com/RafaelDifuria, as well as using the super thanks button here on YouTube. Those really do help this project to be able to continue. And of course, a thank you to those of you who get involved with these episodes and leave your thoughts down in the comment section below. Always interesting to hear what you guys have to say. So whether you agree with me or disagree with me, feel free to take part in the conversation down below. And just before we get into the rest of the episode, a quick common question of the week. For those of you who have lived abroad, what would be some of your do's and don'ts that you would share? And for those of you who haven't lived abroad, what would be some of the concerns that you might have about living on the other side of the world, or maybe living in a country just on the other side of the border? The next do that I'm going to include on this list is make sure that you explore, because you don't know how long you're going to be living in a particular place. I mean, for example, there's been countries that I've lived in that are in a part of the world that I have no interest to travel all the way to get to, because it would be a headache just with the length of travel to get there. And so for me, yes, there are places that I wish I had seen, I wish I had experienced, but they're not important enough that I would actually go ahead and go travel to maybe the other side of the world at this point in my life. So definitely take advantage. Carpe diem, carpe noctem. I mean, sometimes the night is the most fun. I'm not talking about partying, but I'm talking about the stillness and the quiet of the night. But especially when we're talking about some cities in Europe, the evening can be the most fun time to be able to properly take them in. Of course, though, there are daytime activities that can only be done during the day. So, of course, you have to balance things out. The next don't on my list will be don't get stuck in an expat bubble. It's happened all too many times. I see it all the time. And even here where I currently live, there is an expat bubble Granted, it's small, but it exists. And at the same time, though, I would say don't avoid completely expats. I've done a bit of both. I've gotten stuck into expat bubbles, but I've also completely tried to avoid them. And there's a middle ground that I think really works nicely because on one hand, having people that can relate to what you're going through and understand your situation and relate to that can be really comforting at times. And then on the other hand, having people that you can maybe rely on for information that only a local might know will be worthwhile. But of course, making new friendships, regardless of the nationality, can always prove to be a fun cultural experience. There's a lot to learn about places and people you've never seen or met before. The next do on my list is do make sure that you've got your visa ahead of time, or at least you know how to take care of it before arriving. There are a number of countries around Europe where it is not possible to get the visa in the country. You'll have to apply in your current country of residence. So in short, though, wherever you can prove is home is going to be where you'll have to make that application from. I mean, especially for Italy, for example, that's one country where you definitely need to make sure you have your visa to be able to enter the country, because a visa really is more about transit and not necessarily about the ability to remain, even though it is used that way in some other countries. But then once you have entered the country, you will have a limited period of time to be able to get from that permission to enter the country, that visa, and transition over to a permission to remain in the country. Another don't, though, on the list is don't assume the ingredients that you will be cooking with will be all the same. Of course, you'll have some of the basic things that you'll be seeing anywhere: salt, pepper, flour, although flour can change up a little bit depending on where you are and can come with a different result at the end of what you're trying to make. So make sure you buy the right flour, because not all flours are milled alike. But for some things that you might consider to be very basic and simple that you might be able to find anywhere in your home country, might not be as common where you're thinking about moving to. I mean, an example I've used many times, sodium bicarbonate, baking soda, in Italy is not generally kept with the baking goods, the dry baking goods that you would find, like, say, for making cakes and breads and these sorts of things. It would be found instead with the soft drinks. Baking soda is with the soda. And so don't assume also that the layout of your supermarket and how things are put together, the way that products are categorized, is going to be the same in every country. Even having moved from Italy to Portugal, I had to shift a little bit mentally to get used to the layout of where things can be found here, because even if supermarkets do differ a little bit, there is a logic to where kind of certain things are kept next to. From my personal perspective, it was different than what I would have expected back in Italy. The next do on my list would be do have a plan of action, but not only think about the where, but also the when. That is a huge factor when thinking about moving to Europe, especially during certain times of year. If you've seen other episodes of mine recently, you'll know that at least one of those is August, and the other major time is December. So if you are thinking about making a move where you would have to make some plans during one of those months, maybe it's better to give yourself a little extra time so that you can get things done in July or November or September and January, to avoid having to get things done during August or during December. It can be very difficult, especially if you find yourself in countries that maybe are a little bit more traditional, especially when it comes to December. That's going to be when things can be a little quieter and a little bit more difficult to organize. Make sure that you do have a plan for the long term. Are you thinking that you're only going to remain where you're going to be for maybe a couple of years or a couple of months, or do you see yourself being there long term? And so on the long term, it really is worthwhile understanding what is the pathway to permanent residency or citizenship. Because once you have one or the other, that will give you a lot of options and it will give you some security. With a visa or a permission of stay, that can be limiting and the rules can change from one day to the other. Or as we've been seeing here in Portugal, things have been up in the air that people don't know when they're going to be renewed or how they'll be able to renew, or if they can renew their ability to remain in the country. But if you have permanent residency in that country, then you'll be able to be a permanent resident, remain indefinitely in that nation. Citizenship, on the other hand, gives you a few extra bonuses, especially for those of you who are curious about life in different parts of Europe. some parts of Europe and some countries will have requirements that after you gain your citizenship that you might have to remain there. Don't ask me which countries. I don't know off the top of my head. I believe, though, Ireland could be one of those, but don't quote me. But as a citizen of an EU nation, you'll have the ability to travel with the freedom of movement. But I will say the freedom of movement seems to be very often misunderstood, and it's not necessarily the freedom to live anywhere within the European Union. You do have some certain set of rules that you have to follow, and that you have to make sure you're registered in certain ways. It's a much more complicated topic for another time. Not having to think about getting a visa, that makes a big difference at the end of the day, and can really help you. If, for example, if you have a job offer in another country, you can pop over there without really even thinking about it. Whereas if you're the citizen of a third-party country, I guess we could call, then your likelihood of getting that job might not be as high. But the last thing on my list is don't assume that everything will be cheap. Life in Europe, in some countries, may be less expensive than where you're from, and maybe there are going to be places that are less expensive than others. But you have to take into consideration the cost of living has been going up everywhere, and that does not exclude Europe. Yes, even when we're talking about on a blanket statement and a major generalization. And if you're not particular about which country you're looking at, or even the city, it really can be worthwhile from a financial perspective to compare and contrast, because you're now starting to find some cities in some countries that are maybe not even some of the larger cities, the more interesting cities, the more top tier cities, so to speak. As some of you know, I always keep my ear to the ground, and I do search from time to time, and just out of curiosity, and it's a hobby of sorts. Not that I'm always looking, but kind of within the scope of Not Your Average Globetrotter, I do like to know what's up. And I've been looking at cities that maybe you could say would be a couple of tiers lower than another city in another country, but the cost of an apartment and even the cost of living might be very close to a larger city with much more going on for it in another part of Europe. Comparing and contrasting really is important for those who are more flexible with where they're wanting to call home. Of course, there are many people who have their hearts specifically set on a particular country, but I do think in this day and age, it really is worthwhile taking into consideration how much and how little things can cost across the board. Anyway, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time. Later.